Well, hello there, and welcome to Prog Monster. My name's Goofy, and I'll be running the show tonight. And we're here to talk about. What was that? I'm just trying to make an announcement here. Why you keep interfering? Okay, I'll be right back. Excuse me. Hey there. Sorry about that. My brother. Yeah, right. Okay. Anyways, welcome to Prog Monster. My name is Murph, and I am the host of this show. A show that's dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So this will be episode 1, December 1st, of my new series, which I'm calling Progressive Rock Albums from the 1980s. So what we're going to do is it's going to be a one album per group. So there's 31 groups, one album from each of them that came out in the 1980s. So the parameters of this are very simple. Excuse me for a sec. Yeah, be quiet. Okay. So anyways, the parameters for this is very simple. It'll be progressive, primarily progressive rock bands. Some of the bands are going to have a little bit of influence from other types of music. It's hard to find something that's pure progressive, but there's also a few bands in here that I know for a fact will be less than progressive than I want it. But so anyways, how this is going to work is that I will pick an album that I've never heard before. I don't know any of these albums. I've never heard any of them before. And it could be from a band that I'm very familiar with. I may have lots of their albums. They may be one of my favorite bands. It may be a band that I have some albums with and I know them quite well, but I haven't heard this particular album. It could be a band that I've heard of, and maybe I've heard an album from theirs, a different album. Or it could have been a band that I know nothing about and have never heard before. The main part is that I've not heard any of these albums before. Now, some of the albums, since I put this list together a while ago in order to get myself prepared for the list, some of the albums I actually now own. So I will use the props where I have them, just so that people are familiar with it. There's quite a few here, and I want to make sure that people understand these are not my favorites. They can't be my favorites because I never heard them before. So basically, I'm just going to do them. I was going to do them alphabetically, and I thought, that's kind of boring. So what I'm going to do is just do them random, however it hits me. I'll try not to do too many bands in a row that are of the same kind of category. Like, how do I put it? Like, if they're bands I'm really familiar with and I've listened to them a lot, but I haven't listened to this album, I won't do 2 or 3 of those in a row. I'm going to try and mix it up so that it's a little different every day. So basically what I'm going to do is that I'm going to listen to the album. I'll talk about what I've read about this particular album, all the information I normally would give on a look back album. Plus I'll give a little bit of a feel for the songs that I've listened to. So I've only listened to this album once, the one I'm going to do today. And I'm just going to give a general overall feel. I may talk about 1 or 2 or 3 of the tracks on the album that kind of stuck with me a little more. But I know for a fact that listening to an album once, there's not a lot going to stay with you. You may get some general impressions of the group, what you think of them, how they fit, where you think this might go, how you think the album might be after you listen to it for a while, that kind of stuff. But I can't give you any specifics because, like I said, I only listened to it once. So when I'm listening to it, I'm listening for generalities more than I am specifics because I can't really do both at the same time. So what else should I tell you? Okay, yeah, so, and the purpose of this whole thing is to give some attention to some bands that I don't know or some albums I've never heard. It's a chance to open the door for me to hear something that I've never heard before and have a little bit of discussion with it. And some of these albums will eventually I'll end up owning them, and I'll end up putting them on my playlist, and I'll end up doing a look back at a classic rock album and the group may end up being among my favorite bands eventually. So So that's the whole purpose, is to try and generate some new stuff, so that I will be of interest. So anyways, I'm going to start. I've chosen an album to start out with. I looked through all the albums I had, and I decided, okay, so which album should I choose? I thought to myself, well, there's one of the bands in there, I know, I've heard of them. I don't know any of their music. I've never heard any of their music. I may have heard parts of one other album from the 70s, because they're all from this band's from the 70s originally. Actually, I think they go back as far as the 60s. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think they do. I think it's like 68 or maybe 67. And they were basically four guys who were with the band from then. One guy committed suicide, I think, in 76. I think that's the year. For some reason, I remember that year. And if I'm wrong, please correct me, because I have been wrong before. And then the other three guys played with the band till 1998, before the band split, and the two main guys, the two vocalists, I guess, have their own version of the band. So it's kind of like the Sweet, where, like Andy's okay, so I'm drawing a blank on the Sweet now. I can't remember them. Anyways, there's two versions of the Sweet, one by one guy, one by another guy. Now one guy's gone, so there's just the one version, but this is the same kind of thing, they both have their versions of the band. It's called this guy's band, and this one's called this guy's band, but it's still the same band. They're both using the same name. So and I'll talk a little bit about some of the tracks that had some influence on me, but I'm basically going to speak in generalities about it. So I chose this band because I'd heard of them before. I'd seen a couple people talking about them on different episodes of different shows on different channels, and I actually heard there was one, they were talking about an album, so I went and I listened to bits and pieces of the album, and I kind of liked it. But this album is very different from that, because came out in the 80s. I think that one was from the early 70s. Okay, so enough of that. The band we're going to do tonight, is Barkley James Harvest, or BJH. Now, I know that they did have an album where they just put BJH, and they got some flack from their longtime followers, so they basically stuck the Barkley James Harvest thing back on. Anyways, the album I chose this album. There was I could have chose one of 3 or 4 different ones that came out in the 80s. I chose this one because it had a face on the cover that kind of reminded me of iRobot. And so I thought, okay, so this might be a little science fiction-y. That was my thought on the album. So I thought this one looks the interesting one. So I chose, the album is called Face to Face by Barkley James Harvest. Oh, I forgot to write the release date down. Oh, actually, I did write it down. I wrote it in the wrong spot. Okay, so I don't have the length of the album, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But the release date for the album was January the 30th, 1987. The studio was I may get this wrong, Friar Mere in Delft, which was, I believe, owned by John Lees. Yeah, I could be wrong there. And they recorded the album there, and then they did do some additions and some session stuff that they put on the album from a couple of other studios. But primarily, that's where they filmed it. That's where they recorded it. Okay, again, I didn't write down the length of the album, but I remember when I was listening to the album, because I listened to this one online because I don't own it. And I think it was about 48 minutes or so in length, which is a fairly lengthy album, but for the 1980s, but not ridiculously so. So, anyways, Polydor label, produced by Barkley James Harvest and Greg Jackman, who I do not know, but anyways, those are the main things. So Barkley James Harvest are the members of the band. So there were other musicians who did bits and pieces on this album, added like musical parts to the album throughout it, but I didn't list them all because there was quite a few of them, and I didn't really want to get too in depth on it. I did list the main guys. So we have Les Holroyd. I hope I'm pronouncing these right. He's vocals, bass, guitars, and keyboards. John Lees, he's vocals and guitars. And Mel Pritchard, who's drums and percussion. And then, of course, there's a bunch of other guys who fill in some of the other stuff that you hear on the album too. So, okay, about the album. I listened to the entire thing except for one track, which is called "You Need Love," because for some reason it wasn't included on the original vinyl. It was an add-on onto the CD only, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I did find there was two actually like that, "You Need Love" and Kiev. But the Kiev, I found a live version of it, which I watched, which was nice because I got to see what the band really actually kind of looked like. So, I did make a few notes about a few songs, but I'm not going to say too much about all of them. Actually, I don't even know where the note paper is, so just excuse me for 1 second. Okay, thank you for indulging me. Sometimes I'm forgetful. It's called the olds, I think. Anyways, I do have a list of some of the stuff that I may refer to. I may refer to them all. I have the songs on a board and I can talk about them at length, but I'm not going to overly talk about the songs because, again, one time through doesn't really make a memory, you know. So there was a couple of songs on here I liked quite a bit. The one was He Said Love. Okay, so this song, and the other thing I discovered about Barkley James Harvest, at least for this album, is that they like to write about political stuff. They like to write about all kinds of different world issues, I guess, if you want. And this particular song is about Christ. I mean, they don't actually say his name, and they don't say that it's this or that, but the whole song talks about the different things that Christ did when he was here, so pretty obvious who they're talking about. But I like the fact that they didn't use his name, that they just talked about what he did. Draws them a little more interest into him. But I like that song quite a bit. It's a pretty solid song on the album. The other one that I liked a lot was Panic, I think was the song. So I did write down some notes about this, so I'm just going to refer to my notes a little bit as I'm going along. But actually, before I get into that, we'll talk about the album in general. So the overall feel of the album is, it has a progressive sound to it, but it also has a bit of a poppy sound to it. So I think there's enough progressive stuff on this album that it probably will fit into this category. I actually, after it was over, I had some doubts about that, and I was thinking, maybe it's not progressive enough, maybe I should drop it. But then I thought to myself, if you keep dropping albums that for this reason or that reason, it's going to take forever to do this series. So, you chose a Barkley James Harvest, and you've listened to the entire album, and you've done all the paperwork. Let's just go through with it anyways. So I apologize if it isn't entirely as progressive as people would be hoping for here, but it does have some progressive elements about it. There's quite a bit of mellotron on the album, I think. Actually, a fair bit of keyboards. What surprised me is that because the group is kind of, I think it's a little on the mellow side, at least this album. I'm surprised. There's 2 or 3 tracks on here where there's some really heavy riffing guitar and some really detailed and fine kind of like almost like a heavy metal sound guitar solos, so it kind of surprised me that. What else about the album? So how can I describe this band? I thought to myself, how do I describe this album? Okay, so this album, I think it wouldn't be stretching it to say that it's kind of in the same range as Supertramp. It has similar lyrical content, Although I think Supertramp's a little more love-oriented, although there's quite a bit of that on this album too, but they tend to talk about world issues on this album a little more than I would think you would get on Supertramp. The vocals are quite high. I think I haven't listened to it enough to really discern the difference between the two vocalists, and I assume there's two guys singing here because their names are listed after this song or that song, so I'm assuming that it's John Lees and Les Holdren are the two singers, and they split the duties of the songs, kind of like what Supertramp has with Roger Hodgson and Rick Davies. So there's that similarity. Their music is kind of in that same kind of, I get that same kind of feel from it. And the other thing about them is that they're a little bit mellower. They're like mellow, so that all these things contribute to give me that kind of Supertramp thought. But I'll be honest with you, they don't really sound like Supertramp. I think of Supertramp because of those reasons, but I don't hear Supertramp here at all. So I want to make sure that's clear, that I'm not really hearing that here. The album is quite good. At first I was a little bit disappointed. I have to say that I was a little disappointed because I thought it would be more like the album I had heard before, back in this, from the early 70s, and I wish I knew which one it was, but I can't remember. And so I thought there would be a little bit more of that to it, but it's not really like that at all. So I'll just dismiss that. And so once I had heard a couple of songs and I had dismissed that, I started listening to it more for the content that it is. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the tunes now. It starts out with a song called "Prisoners of Your Love." Some nice keyboards on this, a nice keyboard solo, and some fairly heavy guitar. This is one of those songs with that really kind of heavy guitar. The vocalist, I find his voice is quite high. He's like a soprano. So, and in that way, I guess maybe Roger Hodgson comes to mind. And of course, the song I said before, "He Said Love," which is kind of about Christ. It's got some nice, interesting keyboards on it, and there's some very operatic harmonies, which I find there's quite a few songs on the album with these kind of operatic harmonies. So what do I mean by that? Well, they're harmonies that, they're harmonies, of course, but they have that kind of feel that you would get at an opera. That's, I guess, the best way to put it. The other song I liked on here, I'm going to skip a couple of these tunes that weren't as memorable to me, but is this one called "Africa." So this song is about racism. There's no two ways about it. It has a really heavy guitar solo in it, and some pretty heavy guitar and keyboards overall on it. More than I would like. Heavy for these guys. I don't know if it's heavy for like a heavy metal band or anything like that, but pretty heavy here. And the song kind of talks about apartheid. I think that's what it's about. And even though it doesn't sound anything like Stephen Biko or Biko from Peter Gabriel, it reminded me of that because of the topic. Okay, so then the other song that I wanted to talk about was this 9th track here called "Panic." There's some heavy guitar on this, some heavy riffing on this, some really fine keyboard bits on this. I like the drums on this as well, and the guitar solo is probably the best on the album. So there's like some, and the Kiev song, I'll just talk a bit about that because it's the only one I actually had to go looking for. It wasn't, and actually found, it wasn't on the original vinyl, nor was "You Need Love." I could not find any videos for "You Need Love," but Kiev I found, but it was a live presentation by the group, so I watched it and I found it quite interesting. There was actually about 6 guys on stage, so it might have been a version of the song that they did much earlier in their career because they looked fairly young. Maybe they had some session musicians with them on stage. I don't know enough about them to be able to tell you that yet. But I found the album pretty intriguing. Like overall, I warmed up to it towards the end. Definitely will be giving these guys a little more attention. I think the reason I don't own any Barkley James Harvest yet is because every time I go to the record store that I go to and I look for them, there isn't the album I want, or they're like dear, they cost a lot, and I can't find any used ones. I found actually one used one, but it was a compilation and I didn't want to go that route with them. So, but they're definitely on my list of groups to give more attention to. Again, there was less piano on this than I thought there was going to be, because that's one of the reasons why they don't really sound like Supertramp, even though I used them as a comparison, because there's not a ton of piano on this, and there's not, to my knowledge, I don't think there's any sax. There might be one, but I don't remember. There might be one song with sax on it, but I can't recall it. So, a very interesting first choice, I think, for a new band for me. I mean, I'm sure there's people out there who are very familiar with these guys, think highly of them, and I can understand why they might. These guys are pretty talented individual. I think the guitar player really has some skills here. Having only listened to it once, I can tell he really has a pretty solid knowledge of guitars here, and even he did like 3 or 4 fairly really good solos on here, and I like some of the riffing too. So he does play a lot of acoustic stuff as well, or at least there is some acoustic on the album. I don't know if it's him or one of the session musicians playing it. But when I heard the guitar solos, especially that last one on Panic, I thought, wow, this guy can play the guitar. Drummer is pretty good, I think, pretty good. Nothing outstanding, I don't think. At least I never heard anything. And they play quite a bit of mellotron here, which is nice, because that's an instrument that I quite like. And some synthesizers too, like some synthesizer parts. So the vocals are the interesting part for me. I didn't really hear any distinction between the two vocalists, but I was only listening this the first time through, and I didn't. When I first listened to it, I hadn't looked up any of the information. I had just was listening to the album, because I don't. The first time I listened to something, and maybe I gotta have to change it for this series, but the first time I listened to something, I just listening. I don't want any kind of distraction about who's doing what, or who made this album or who didn't. I don't want any of that kind of distraction, because sometimes that can have an influence on what you're hearing. So generally speaking, I like to hear the album and have no influences, and just hear it and kind of make an assessment of it the first time of my own volition without any kind of distraction. But I didn't hear any real distinction between the two vocalists, so maybe it may end up there's only one guy singing, I don't know. Or maybe the two guys are in the same range, or maybe I didn't hear it enough to be able to distinguish the two. So those are the possibilities. But overall, he wasn't bad. It was pretty strong vocal performance. I think the vocalist is one of the strong suit of this group. It's very different sounding. I don't know if I like it or I dislike it. It's just different, you know. So anyways, there you have. That's our first episode of the month, December 1st, episode 1, Barkley James Harvest. Album is Faces to Faces. If you haven't seen it, it's an album with a face on the cover and it's looking up. It's kind of like a robotic face. And that's the name of the album, Face to Face. So if I get a prop, I would show it to you, but you know, to buy 31 albums to do a series is quite a bit to ask, especially if you could actually find them all. And many of these I won't be able to find, because going forward there's going to be at least 4 albums in this series. At this point in time, there's 4 I have listed that are not English. They're basically other languages. There's 3, I think, a German one, a couple of French ones, and a Italian one. I'm trying to give more attention to different languages, because there's progressive rock in other languages, you know, which is not really surprising to me, but I didn't realize how many there was, especially in the French. There's quite a few of the French ones, but I chose a couple that looked interesting to me. So So anyways, we'll be moving forward tomorrow with yet another one. I'm still not sure what that one will be. I'm going at whatever I can find that's easiest to start with. That's what I'm going to do. But I'm not going to try and do too many that are like well known to me right off the bat. I want to kind of space them out. So I'm thinking that I'll probably go with Jethro Tull tomorrow. There's an album in the 80s that there's actually a couple I hadn't heard, and I chose one of them because I actually own the album but haven't actually played it yet because I've had so many albums to listen to. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe, and come join me tomorrow for episode 2 of my December series entitled Progressive Rock Albums of the 1980s. Take care. Have a good day. Bye.